Hello, and welcome to the Narrowing Path, Walking the Spiritual Walk. My name is Stephen Eiderstein. Thank you all for joining me as we do the review for Chapter 7 of the book we've been reading right now, which is I Was a Pagan by VII Kitchen. There we go. Let's see if we can get a little bit closer. There we go. It's always a fun time doing this. But anyway, that's one of the original copies of the book. And you'll see me picking this one up as we go through the review today. This is a reprint of the book I just showed you. It's called facsimile reprint, so it literally has the exact page layout just copied into it. So I marked this one up with all the fun highlighting and everything. So I'm looking forward to it. This chapter is called The Business of Being Reborn in Life. So it's a very good chapter. If you listened to the reading we went through last week, you'll know that what this is all about, and it's about the beginning of the author's spiritual experience. So it was very, very good, and it was exciting to read it. I haven't read it in a while, so it was nice to go through it and then go through it again to highlight stuff and talk about things. So I'm looking forward to it. So I appreciate everybody that takes a listen and is going through this with me. If you want, go ahead, like us on Facebook, and we also are available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So check us out in those places. Look forward to it. Now, here we go. Let's go ahead and get into this because it was a very in-depth chapter, and a chapter with a lot of things to talk about, a lot of experiences, and a lot of really cool things. So this chapter, like I said, the chapter title is The Business of Being Reborn in Life, and then the subtitle is Transformation. Now, that just kind of sets the expectation of how powerful of a chapter it's going to be. So it had to live up to the name, and it really did, for me at least. I hope you all found the same when you listened to it listen to the reading of the chapter from last week. But I loved it because it directly opens up with him talking about how he previously used to live, right? So in the beginning, we had this description of how he used to live, and it was almost glorified because that's what he thought at the time, right? He was writing it from how he was experiencing it at that time. And as we've progressed, we go into this place of how much he knows it's futile, and it doesn't make it was a hollow existence. He says it's something like, it seems amazing that anyone whose life had grown as futile as mine should want to hang on to his fruitless pursuits and tasteless diversions, right? So he's admitting right off the bat that the way he lived was just empty and hollow and didn't actually have much effect, or wasn't as fulfilling as he was hoping it was going to be. And so he's immediately making that comparison, which is always it's interesting to see how he does that, right? And then he goes into these 3 laws for him to practice, or describing these 3 laws and how he wasn't participating in these 3 laws, right? So, and these are the 3 laws. I haven't read about these in any other literature except for this book. That doesn't mean it's not mentioned in any of the Oxford group literature, but the 3 laws that he talks about, it seems to be associated with the Oxford group, the way he phrases them and the way he stages them. And it's the law of self-denial, the law of fellowship, and the law of obedience, right? And what he does is he goes through and he talks about how the way he lived was in direct contradiction to the laws that he found suggested through the Oxford group. And it's kind of setting us up to show us the difference between what worked for him and what didn't work for him, right? So his vain pursuits, his futile living, was one that didn't satisfy any of these 3 laws. And his transformation is his surrender and subjecting himself to these laws, right? So that first law of self-denial, he was talking about it, and he just talked about how he just wanted to do whatever it is he wanted to do. He just um, wanted to continue to pursue the things that he thought would bring him joy and bring him happiness, right? The drinking, the womanizing, the smoking, and the arrogance, right? So he continued that path. So that this law of self-denial is one where you sacrifice the things that you believe will bring you joy and happiness in this life to follow a different path, right? Like those pleasureful things, those hollow actions we take, right? And sacrifice them to following the will of a higher power. And he wasn't willing to do that, right? He said, even though it was vain and it didn't work anymore, I still couldn't do it. And then he said, so he just wanted to do what he wanted to do. That's kind of the self-will of this whole thing. And then he didn't want to participate in the fellowship, right? The law of of fellowship, like actually communing honestly with another person, actually connecting with somebody, authenticity. It wasn't something that he was able to actually do. It wasn't something he was even interested in doing. He avoided it like the plague, actually. He just didn't want anybody to be led into his little life, which never works out well for anybody involved in those circumstances, right? And then the last is the law of obedience, which is he just wanted to do everything his way. He just wanted his life to work out the way he wanted it to work out, and he was going to exert his will and do whatever it was he needed to do to make sure it turned out that way, or at least best of his ability, right? So there was no willingness to go a different route. It was him doing the things that he thought were going to be the best for him. Completely selfish and self-serving. All three of these things are selfish and self-serving, right? So, and then he really identifies the thing that kept him locked in this cycle of not subjecting himself to those spiritual laws, we'll call them. And it was pride that kept him stuck. And I was going to read that little blurb here. I was fighting at the time, although I did not know it, to retain my own, not only my comforts and the strong material affinities I had formed in life, but to keep some vestige of my self-approval and hold on to the remnants of my pride. It was his pride. It was his ego just holding him in place so he couldn't actually change, right? Like he wanted to hold on to this portrait that he painted for everyone else. He wanted to make sure that he held on to those empty things that he had put into his life that he thought would serve him, because he still had this belief that it would serve him, and what it ended up doing was consistently keeping him locked in the same cycle. And it was a fight to keep it, right? I like how he opened that with that. I was fighting at that time, although I did not know it, right? That's what so many of us do. That's what I did. That was my experience. I was fighting the world and everybody in it and everything in it to make it try to fit into this picture that I wanted it to fit into. And it doesn't work that way, it turns out. And I related to it when he was talking about this. I really related to it. And then he goes on to talk about a powerless philosophy, dry and dusty ethics, all the things he tried, like a pleasure-filled life, all the ways he was trying to actually find fulfillment and a purpose in his life, and he couldn't actually do it. All those plans we talked about in the first chapters, all those different aspects of living that he tried to use. Philosophy, pleasureless psychology, intellectualized metaphysics, right? None of that worked. But now he's been introduced to the Oxford group, and this spiritual growth that he's trying to actually pursue, they seem to have found, right? And he says here, but when through contact with the Oxford group, I actually began to find satisfaction in self-denial when I actually found fellowship instead of shame in honest sharing. That's important. And when, through obedience to a higher law, I gained my first knowledge of true freedom. There began that change of feeling, which culminated in the change of my entire life, right? So we got introduced to a group of people where he could honestly, well, you could see examples of people honestly sharing. He could see examples of people not drinking, which was huge for him, and not pursuing these vain or hollow pleasures, and then taking right actions in accordance to the God of their understanding, rather than in accordance to what they thought was good for themselves, right? So they were of service to their God and their higher power, whatever that might be for you. Again, when I talk about God here, my definition and your definition do not have to be the same. Source, energy, universe, nature, whatever you would like to fit into that category, that's fine. Just know that's what we're talking about here. So, and when he found people, though, that were demonstrating these qualities, that's what began to change his life, because he came in contact with that spiritual environment that allowed him to grow, right? And then this next part is how he, for the first time, really tried self-denial. Right? Now, what we mean by self-denial is like these little pleasures, right, that we indulge in to make ourselves feel better, to be able to get through life. Because the way we look at life and the way we exist in this world is not something that we can do without them, right? Like for him, it was drinking and womanizing and smoking tobacco is what we're going to talk about next, right? And just rushing through his job, the prestige and all that kind of stuff. That all gets relevant in this next one, though, because he had to go do this. He talks about this business trip he has to take, which he usually hates, and he rides the train and he smokes all of this tobacco with his pipe. And he actually, for the first time, asked this God that he found, that the Oxford group told him about, to help him not smoke, because usually he just smokes all the time, and he can never actually put it down, right? And what happened was it worked. What happened was he didn't even crave it. He didn't even care for it. He didn't even want it. It was the first time I had ever won a battle of this kind that seemed to me an utter lack of struggle. Lack of struggle. He didn't sit there obsessing about it and then deny himself, like, oh, I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it. But all I want to do is it. He didn't even have the desire to do it anymore, at least on this trip, from what he wrote, right? And he was like, wow, he found that this power, or this peace, right? This was a very important thing, because he had this micro experience almost through the Oxford group. And then he had another one because he asked for help with like not smoking all this tobacco as he went on this trip, and didn't like blow his lungs out, right? And what he realized was this thing that helped him is what he's been pursuing, right? He calls it a better self, and tried to argue against it being God in this section almost. I felt a strange sense of dependence on some power that was utterly dependable. That's a stable, consistent. That's things that I was looking for in my life: stability, consistency, dependability, right? A power within, yet coming from outside myself. A power far stronger than I was. And even as I tried to argue, if this power were only my better self, so he's still trying to like take credit for it. So he's still having a battle with his ego, but we got to start somewhere, right? What a great relief it would be. It would always be to have that better self to depend on, right? And he talks about how this better self would give him clarity. This God of his understanding, this strength would give him a sense of understanding and clarity. He doesn't have to, how did he say it? No more uncertainty of mind, no more question. Should I do this or should I do that? he says, there would be but one answer to every question, but one right answer for me. The clear, unhesitating answer that this other power, God, whatever you want to call it, again, like I said, would always give me, right? There's lack of question. When you start to begin to do the right thing instead of what's the right thing for me, because usually there's a right thing that's of service that takes us out of the picture, right? And at least if you look for that, there is. And that gives you a sense of strength, steadfastness in your decision. Because when you decide to do the right thing, you don't question it anymore. You don't put it up for debate or anything like that. It's an amazing thing. So he talks about asking God for help with smoke and tobacco, and the whole trip he doesn't smoke, and then he realizes this power is something that he wants to have in his life consistently because it provides clarity and understanding. Then he goes into what else happened in that trip. And it's amazing actually what he talks about, because not only did he not smoke, he did not have the desire to smoke, but he also found a new how to say this it reignited his desire to, and his desire and interest in his own job to actually help his clients and to help the people he was building advertisements for. It talks about how he was able to focus on these things, and instead of just trying to rush it through, instead of just trying to wave off their suggestions or their preferences, he wants to actually make them a better advertisement and incorporate what they had and actually improve on what he's doing, instead of just trying to brush it off, show them what he's got, get them to approve it, pay for it, and move on. He actually was trying to be of service to the people he was going to see, not just view it as an inconvenience to his life, right? So it talks about how the early train he was trying to get to and take home came and left, and then multiple trains after that. And then when he finished, he was like, well, that's how that went. And he was surprised with himself. And then he went through and ate dinner, and then a train that was supposed to leave even earlier ended up breaking down, came back, they fixed it, and so he got to take another train home. He says it was almost like a God was looking out for him at the time. And I thought that was very interesting. So from the spirituality perspective, he asked God for help to remove the desire to smoke tobacco, and what that was replaced with was a feeling of being of service to his job and his client, to his employer, and to his client that he was working with. Right now, that is a substantial shift, right? And he stopped trying to control when he was going to get home, when he wanted to get out of there. He just let the whole situation play through. And it turned out to be a fantastic experience for him. Everything seemed to work out for him in a way he never would have imagined. And that's just a snapshot of what was possible, right? That's just so encouraging that that type of experience was even possible to happen. And what actually happened in those moments in that day was he was introduced to a different way to live. He was introduced to a spiritual life that was possible beyond his own comprehension, right? That's one of the hardest things we struggle with when we start to walk this spiritual walk, is the fact that, hey, I don't know what other way there is to live. We hide from it. We don't believe there's anything beyond our own awareness. But what this did was it showed him that there was something else going on, that there was a different way to actually engage in life, and there was a different perspective to take. And at the end of this, he talks about how, what did he say? This, to say the least, had been a day of unusual occurrences, and I decided that there might, after all, be some fun in living, with my usual comforts and interests less at heart. So stopping trying to just drink and smoke and party as much as he thinks he needs to do to get through a day. There might be a different way to do this. And he says, I did not realize it then, but I had already begun to live within the laws of self-denial. So this experience that we talked about here was the example he gave to begin to live within the laws of self-denial. So this first law that he referenced in the beginning, where he said that I couldn't do it. These 3 laws, I couldn't do it. So he's sacrificing the short-term gratification and pleasures that he thought he needed to entertain the possibility that there was a different way to live. It's pretty powerful stuff, pretty incredible stuff, right? And then he talks about how he started how he started to even believe he could honestly share with other people, right? He talked about his experience going to the Oxford group and seeing other people doing it. And then even though he still avoided at the Oxford group, if you remember when we went over that last chapter, he still, on that ride home, was sharing honestly with his friend in that car. He was having some real deep conversations about it, to the point where he says in here, him and his friend actually went and woke his wife up so she could participate in the conversation and have another person to go through, right? And he says here something pretty impactful here. I actually imagined myself sitting beside her and telling her things I was sure I could never tell her, right? So the seeds of the law of fellowship, which is really authenticity, right? Which is really a genuine personality, which really is integrity at the end of the day, like honestly sharing without barrier with all those around you that you love, right? To not hold shame over your story and over your experiences. This was new, right? And then he went up again to the Oxford group, right? It wasn't as long of a stay. But what he found, this time we stayed but a day and a night, yet that was enough to water the seed already planted, the seed of fellowship, right? We were not, this is him and his friend, as we thought, fully convinced yet. Oddly enough, as we drove home the second time, each was ready to defend the movement valiantly when anyone started to criticize what he had seen and heard. So they're not, the funny thing is, he talks about this contradiction. He doesn't believe what's going on for himself. I'm not buying into it, but what they do works, right? He was willing to defend it. Him and his friend were willing to actually defend this thing, even though he wasn't actively participating in it for himself, right? Now that says something. He sees the value in it. He doesn't necessarily understand the value fully yet, but he at least sees the value in it. So it was just a very important part of this whole thing that happened for him, right? But after he got back the second time, he sat down with his wife and shared everything that he thought he would never share. And then he listened as she shared honestly too. And it was, thought I wrote something. I got my notes right here. Sorry. He shared everything with his wife, and she shared with him, and then he felt the relief of honesty, right? He talks about in this part having a actual physical sensation of relief, right? And he talks about how exhausted, and I don't, anyone that's had this experience, I mean, it's very similar. What he's talking about here is what 12-step programs would equate to a 5th step, right? Which is going through your inventories and actually having an honest conversation about somebody, about who you are, what goes on, and what you've done, and the kind of man and or woman or person that you are, right? So that equates to the fifth step. And he talks about taking off the masks, right? How many of us can relate to that? I know I can. I've had a ton of masks in my life. And when I actually got into recovery and I got into this spiritual solution and this spiritual way of living, suddenly I couldn't hold on to mask anymore. The disingenuous um, personas that I had, I couldn't maintain. I had to let them go, and I had to actually be an authentic man of integrity if I was to live differently. And the freedom that comes from that, right? This sensation of release and freedom is, I now know, the most universal experience for all who face and confess their sins under the eyes of God and one other person, right? Yeah, that sounds exactly like a fifth step, right? And it's 40, he says it earlier, 40,000 pounds had rolled off our shoulders. Him and his wife started pretty much a new relationship in that moment because they became current. They became honest with each other about where each other was, how hugely impactful that is right now, and how much so many people, I think, yearn for that type of connection, that type of authenticity, to be able to speak and be heard, and then to also listen, and to be able to have that collaborative effort of two people trying to build and grow together in the spiritual journey, because that's really where that journey lies, and it's just an amazing thing to get someone's actual testimony of this. And then after I have this experience that shows how true this is, I guess that's why it means so much to me. And it means so much to many people that have gone through a 12-step program or have received help through even therapy or anything like that, because they've had this experience of having these conversations to grow through and um, disclose, right? And then after he found this acceptance and this freedom through this experience of sharing honestly and authentically, right? He had this closeness with his wife, but he also felt this closeness with a God of his understanding, right? He had this presence that he felt because he felt like he had wiped the slate clean, or he didn't have to hide things. He didn't have to hide in the shadows over what was going on. And what a freeing thing that so many of us wish to have, to be able to live authentically. And then it talks about how this was his step into participating in the fellowship, which is the authentic um, which is to authentically engage with other people without trying to manipulate or present in different ways so you control what they think or what they do. You just are able to show up and be you, which so many people wish they could do today. And that is how he began to participate in the fellowship, the laws of fellowship. So he's in two: self-denial, fellowship. Now, the next part, which is interesting to me, is he talks about how getting in touch with God is great. That first contact, it's a start, but God doesn't trust you. The way he says this is very interesting. I'm just going to read it. Forming a clean contact with God, however, does no good unless God then chooses to release his power, right? And God, as I have said before, will not do so unless he knows that he can trust you with that power. He will not give you power to use as you wish, but only as he wills, and only for as long as you surrender your own will in absolute obedience. Okay, so we're talking about the law of obedience next. We've already got two. So we're submitting to the will of something greater than ourselves at this point. And he says, it's great to have this connection, to have this participation in the fellowship, to have this clean slate almost, to have this sense of genuineness back. But God will only entrust you with power if you're not going to use it to serve yourself. If you're not only going to try to make people do what you want them to, or make people think of you the way you want them to think of you, and be manipulative and just use it for your own personal growth and your own personal gain, he's not going to give you it. You have to demonstrate the fact that you're willing to follow the principles of his teachings, the willing to follow a way of living that would allow his will to play out through you, whether you liked it or not, right? The willingness to do his will is what you need to actually ask God for that type of power to help other people. And I can understand people's hesitance to this type of conversation, right? Because what's God do? Infuse you with power, right? But it's not a type of power where you can feel it pumping through your veins necessarily, but it's the power to be honest, and it's the power to have hope and faith, and it's the power to be genuinely of service to other people. And what other people experience is the presence of something greater than themselves, because you're doing the right thing, regardless of whether it serves yourself or not, right? I do believe that we have to act in a way that makes space for God to come in and work through us. Now, can we make that call? Do we dictate what that looks like? No. Right? Most of the time, we don't even know it's happening, but the other people experience a feeling that we didn't know was even going on. We were actually probably uncomfortable because we were doing something we didn't actually want to do, but it was the right thing to do. But then somebody else has an experience that helps them move forward in their journey that we didn't even know we were helping facilitate. How incredible is that? And that's what we're talking about here, right? He's changed from God's will to his will. Talks about how he had to have an experience. He talks next about how he had to have this spiritual experience with his wife, and he prayed with her. And I wanted to read the prayer that he actually said with her. He can't remember it specifically, but this might sound familiar to those in a 12-step program. I surrender thee my life, my entire life, oh God. I have made a mess of it, trying to run it myself. You take it, the whole thing, and run it for me, according to your will and your plan, and your will and plan. Now, if that doesn't sound like a third step prayer, I don't know what does. And it also reminds me of the 11th, what people would consider the 11th step prayer. I've been told is the 11th step prayer, which is the prayer of St. Francis, right? Let me understand instead of be understood. Let me love instead of be loved. Let me forgive instead of be forgiven, right? Like, let me exemplify these principles and values instead of demand that the world gives them to me. That's a pretty hard thing to do, right? To actually hand these things over to a God of your understanding, to a power greater than yourself, to the universe, whatever you'd like to call it, and choose and surrender your will to behave and to act in certain ways, regardless of how you feel about them, right? What we're given, and when we start to live a spiritual life, is a design to live by, right? To make decisions by, to guide our actions, to guide how we live in this world. So that doesn't always line up to what we want to do selfishly, but we choose to live a principled spiritual life. And that is how we demonstrate obedience to a God of our understanding. Now, it's not easy. It's not necessarily fun, especially in the beginning. Eventually, you realize it's worth it. Eventually, you realize it's the only way to actually live and have true freedom and joy, and happiness and contentment and peace and serenity. Those are byproducts of following and being obedient to a God of your understanding and living a spiritual way of life. You can't aim for those things. You aim to be of service. You aim to follow the will of God in your life. And then as a byproduct, you find joy and happiness, peace. All of these things we've always wanted, we find those as a byproduct. So he's changing from let me run my life my way to let God run my life the way you would have it be. He's submitted to the laws of obedience here. And it's a wholly different thing for him. It's brand new, right? So now we've gotten to the point in this chapter to where he's gone from completely denying, completely avoiding all three of these laws to now participating in the laws of obedience. Or what was the first one? The law of self-denial, the law of fellowship, then the law of obedience, right? And his life is starting to change. His life is starting to have a really, really strong spiritual experience because of it. So I wanted to just read how he actually phrased this. It's on the bottom of 103 if anyone's actually bought this book or has this book. As we emerged, and he's talking, we as his wife, as we emerged into this new environment, we felt ourselves responsive to new stimuli. We gained, as it were, new senses, like a man who, paralyzed through life, had awakened to his first definite sense of sunshine and heat and cold and taste and touch and smell and hearing. They're experiencing an entire new world, which I relate to when I got sober and when I got involved in spirituality. It's like the blinders fell off, and suddenly I was present in a world I didn't even know existed, but it was right in front of me the whole time. Like such a man, we found ourselves in a wholly new relationship with the world in which we were living. It was a fact. A world in which, it was, in fact, a wholly new world. A world in which Jesus Christ, who had been to me a dead historical character, became a vital, living presence who could actually be felt. With the inspiration of this presence, it was a world in which the moral and spiritual qualities of human beings, or their lack, were as clearly discernible as their mental and physical qualities had been in the world of a former understanding. So this is so important, because actually when you start to understand spirituality and you start to see how it applies in your life and how you were lacking it and how it guided all of your actions and guided your mental health and your physical health and all of these things, when you start to actually realize these things, you start to see it in other people. It starts to become clear as day as to what's going on. And you don't judge them and you don't condemn them for it. You observe it and you realize they're just spiritually sick. There's a compassion that grows in you. There's an empathy that grows in you. There's this understanding. Because there was a time when you didn't know it either. There was a time when I had no idea what spiritual living meant, what spiritual living was about. But now, I've been blessed with the opportunity to change that. I've been blessed with the opportunity to learn what that was. And I never really knew that that was a possibility for a guy like me. So it's amazing when you get to there, and they talk about he quotes his wife. He said, "Now said my wife, I know what is meant by the peace that passeth all understanding." Right? We don't actually we think we know peace. We think we know serenity. We think we know understanding, but we don't until we actually understand it in a spiritual aspect, in a spiritual way. It's kind of mind-blowing when you come to these understandings, when you actually have true peace for the first time, when you don't demand the world to give you peace, but you just have it, and the world can be as it is. That's what the truth of peace is. I carry it within me. You can carry it within you. It's pretty incredible. Awesome, actually, in the truest sense of awesome. In its true definition, when you actually get to a point like that. And they try to, the thing is, like, they have this experience and they try to tell their friends about it. And they're like, "Oh yeah, no, we've had that. This is just new for you. You know, you're fine." But they still have all of these qualities that show that they aren't, right? They still are judgmental and all these things where they're like, "Oh, I've had the peace and this experience of spirituality before." And he says, "No, but they truly haven't, because if they had, they would understand what he was actually talking about. They meant being in tune with nature, the reverence and awe you may feel sitting on a sand dune, looking out at the ocean, or sitting on top of a high mountain. I too had felt these things, but I can assure my readers, and so can thousands of others in the Oxford group and elsewhere, that they are nothing, nothing, nothing at all, comparatively with the deep, vital, life changing experience of facing your sins honestly and of then surrounding your life to God wholly and without reserve. Without reserve. I had not lived at all until I began with this new quality of life, a life which is lived within the laws of self-sacrifice, fellowship, and obedience. It's an actual way of living that he found. It's an actual different world. It's a different interaction. It's a different perspective to hold and have and to function within, right? It's a life to be righteous and have godlike character and to be striving for that, to be looking to improve yourself, to be able to be of service to the people in your life in a more authentic and genuine way. It's a way of living that he just never knew was possible, right? And the thing is, now he's finally found that ability to, how he phrased, grow a soul in this world. And it was more beautiful and magnificent than he ever thought possible, right? It's he found the world of spiritual growth was in a shift in perspective in where he is right now. It's incredible. He used to live this hollow and empty life. He talks about that too. My own sweet way instead of self-promoting plans and the inevitable frustration. He has tapped into the energy pattern of God as free, rhythmic as a bird and different from the slow and stupid mapped out plans of men. He's functioning in a different way, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, because of this experience that he's had. How incredible. How incredible. And I just wanted to read the last paragraph. I only had part of it. I'm going to read the whole thing, though. It was thus that I found the higher affection, which my false gods, philosophies, ethics, and psychology could not supply. I came upon it not by hearsay, but through actual personal experience. I learned to want to live this higher quality of life through actually tasting the only love in the world that surpasses man's love of self and gives him the power of regeneration. Gives the only power that will overcome man's love of self. What a power. That's an incredible statement to me, because there was nothing that I thought would take that seat over, right? I thought it was always going to be me that I looked out for. And it was just going to be a fight to try to do right once in a while, right? But after having this spiritual experience, after having my own experience like this, and I love this description that he's put about it and how he's explained it and these things that he's actually indicated in it. And then he just talks about this fullness of life, and how being of service and to a God of our understanding and then to others and this world has taken the place of just serving himself. And yeah, I never thought that would be possible for someone like me. But it's that love that we can actually contact that gives us this willingness to change, this willingness to do differently. So anyway, fantastic, absolutely fantastic chapter. Loved it. I hope y'all did too. I would highly suggest reading it yourself. Follow along with me as I read it on the last one, because what I pulled out of there was a lot, but this was 45 minutes, guys. I could probably tear apart this chapter line by line, and have a different experience every time too. So please, I encourage you, get the book, read it yourself, see what resonates with you. But thank you all so much for joining me, and I look forward to next weekend when we go through and we do read the next chapter, which is called This Business of Getting New Bearings. orientation, right? Because after you have this experience, how do you live with it truly, right? It, everything's changed. So I'm excited to read that too. Get a little bit refresher myself. It's not a bad thing. So thank you all for joining me. And until next time, thanks.